Before the memory card, games had to be completed in one sitting, with progress being temporarily saved on the console's RAM and then erased when the power was cut. Another option is the use of password systems that would require the user to write down and recall a string of letters, words, or even symbols. By inputting the required codes, games could be started from where the user previously left off. Some games, like The Legend of Zelda and Maniac Mansion, had internal batteries that allowed for save data to be stored within the game's cartridge. These methods of storing save data were all viable within cartridge-based media throughout the 8 and 16-bit eras of gaming. But around the mid-1990s, the venture into disc-based media was in full swing, with the compact disc being called the way of the future. For developers, this meant a greater storage capacity for game data. For manufacturers, it meant cheaper costs, as cartridges were more expensive, with the necessary chips, board, and hard plastic casing needed for assembly. While not all gaming industry giants bought into the disc-based media immediately, some developers jumped in with both feet. Coming off their failed partnership with Sony, Nintendo wouldn't launch their first fully fledged disc-based console until 2001 with the release of the Nintendo GameCube. The Famicom Disk System and the Nintendo 64 DD didn't see widespread international releases. Early adopters, Sega jumped into disc-based media in 1992 with their Sega CD, a disc reading attachment for the Sega Genesis. And later in 1995 they released the Sega Saturn, the first Sega console to play exclusively compact discs. Meanwhile, Sony, after being ditched in their partnership with Nintendo, made their maiden voyage into the video game industry with the Sony PlayStation in 1995. This began an era where video game consoles started requiring memory cards as part of their day-to-day usage, as compact discs could not save games due to being in a read-only format. Even the Nintendo 64 would support memory cards for files that were too large to store on the cartridge. For the next decade, memory cards would come to be a staple in the video game industry until hard drive discs would later become the industry standard.
When it comes to memory cards, there are a huge variety of game-saving peripherals, both licensed and unlicensed, across a wide spectrum of gaming platforms. Most memory cards are pretty typical and look like a small, rectangular brick. One of the most interesting and innovative type of memory cards was the brainchild of video game veterans Sega for use with their then new, at-home console, the Dreamcast. They named their venture the Visual Memory Unit, or VMU for short. The VMU, at its core, was a memory card. However, in typical Sega fashion, the VMU was capable of much more than just its primary job of saving game data. Similar to most video game peripheral hardware, VMUs were produced in a variety of colors and designs. North American markets saw the release of multiple translucent colored VMUs, while Japan, in addition to having colored VMUs, also received branded VMUs, featuring characters like Sonic the Hedgehog, Hello Kitty, and Godzilla. The Sega Dreamcast VMU, released in Japan in 1998 and the US in 1999, featured a whopping 8-bit processor provided by television manufacturer Sanyo, a 128 kilobyte flash memory, and ran using two CR2032 or button cell batteries. The VMU clicks into the top of the Dreamcast controller, with the VMU's screen fitting into the square opening at the top of the controller. This allows the image from the VMU's LCD screen to be seen through the opening on the controller while the Dreamcast is being played. As there are two slots on the top of the Dreamcast controller, one can choose to insert two VMUs for file transferring, or a VMU and a rumble pack. Some third-party memory cards include both storage and rumble capabilities, but at the sacrifice of the visual aspect. The VMU adds many little bonus features, most commonly in the form of mini-games and game enhancers, to a wide variety of Dreamcast games. Now for a fun fact. The VMU can still store data and display images in the controller even with dead batteries. Upon startup of the Dreamcast console, if the VMU's batteries are dead when it is plugged into the controller, the user will be greeted with a loud, droning beep to make known the status of the battery power. This beep is by no means subtle or unobtrusive. In addition to storing and organizing game data, the VMU can also be used as both a calendar and a clock. However, some of the features the VMU has to offer can't be taken advantage of unless it is removed from the controller and taken on the go. Let's look at what the VMU has to offer. One of the most notable on-the-go games is Chow Adventure. Chow Adventure is a mini-game that is available on the VMU by using the Sonic Adventure games. When you gain access to the Chow Garden in Sonic Adventure 1 and 2 is when the VMU minigame can be unlocked and played. When you gain access to the Chow Garden, the first thing you have to do is hatch a Chow egg. Hold on, this might take a second. As soon as your Chow hatches, you can take him over to the transfer pack and put him in your VMU. Once Chow is safely inside the VMU, you can disconnect the VMU from the controller, launch the Chow Adventure game, and see what adventures unfold. During Chow Adventure, you must guide your Chow from one end of the map to the other end of the map. Along the way, your Chow will trip, try to sleep, and get distracted by toys. You have to give encouragement to your Chow by pressing the A button when an obstacle gets in the way. Sometimes your Chow will encounter a bully Chow and have to fight his way out. When you win a fight, you are rewarded with items from a treasure chest, and often a stat power-up. These powered-up stats can be used in both Chow Adventure and in the Sonic Adventure Chow Gardens for obstacles like Chow races. When it finally comes time for Chow to make his way back to the home garden, you'll dock the VMU once again, make your way to the transfer port, and pop! Out comes Chow, back home again. It's worth noting that for the GameCube re-releases of Sonic Adventure DX and Sonic Adventure 2 Battle, there is still a Chow Garden and an external Chow game, but instead they're used with a Game Boy Advance and the GBA game, Sonic Advance. Believe it or not, there are even linked features that can be done with 2 VMUs and the Chow Adventure minigame. To connect VMUs, the ports on the top of the unit, where the VMU would plug into the controller, actually can connect to one another. Once you've built your chain of VMUs, linked play can commence. According to the manual for Sonic Adventure, when the VMU are linked, Chow can battle one another, as well as set up Chow dates? Oh goodness, I didn't realize Sonic Adventure was a dating sim. Anyways, for those of you wondering, Chow Adventure 2, accessible through Sonic Adventure 2, boasts a few new options, including a few more Chow stats, more conversations with your Chow, and a slot machine game for your enjoyment. Now for a disclaimer. The next few VMU minigames have been emulated and may not quite function to their fullest potential due to a variety of reasons. One of my personal favorite Dreamcast games, Soul Calibur, actually has 3 bonus minigames when used with the VMU. However, this only works with the Japanese version of Soul Calibur. Another game with VMU-compatible minigames is the platform fighting game Power Stone. Some other games that feature full-fledged minigames are Skies of Arcadia, Sega GT, and Zombie Revenge. It's also worth noting that there's a fairly decent-sized homebrew community for the VMU. People have not just made their own VMU games, but they've also made VMU-compatible versions of classics from other publishers, like Nintendo. While the best the VMU has to offer probably lies within the Sonic Adventure series of games, the VMU adds a few little gameplay components to other titles as well. The following games have features that are accessible while the VMU is docked in the Dreamcast controller. In Sonic Shuffle, a Mario Party-style game, the players move around a giant game board through the use of numbered cards. When played without VMUs, the players' cards are displayed on the screen for all to see. However, if each player has a VMU in the controller, the numbered cards will be displayed on the VMU screen and kept secret from other players. In Resident Evil Code Veronica, the player can dock the VMU and it will display the player character's health bar and pulse rate within the controller's window. When damage is taken, it will reflect accordingly on the VMU screen. This functionality is also mirrored in another Capcom survival horror game, Dino Crisis. While there are other Dreamcast games that feature both docked and undocked VMU capabilities, like Jet Grind Radio and Shenmue, in the interest of keeping this video a reasonable length, we'll cut to our next visual memory unit.
As history has shown, when one person has a good idea, others tend to want to utilize that same idea. Competitors will always rise up to imitate or challenge the throne of an innovator. Right after the launch of Sega's VMU in 1998, Sony jumped into the interactive memory card market 6 months later in January of 1999 with their own spin on the memory card, the PocketStation. Unlike other game controllers around this time period, the DualShock controller was a complete unit. It did not have expansion ports like the Dreamcast, N64, or Xbox controllers. This meant that a gamer had to plug the PocketStation directly into a PlayStation's memory card slot. While the PocketStation is in this mode, it's relatively useless. The screen occasionally displays content, but in most cases it's nothing important. This is the exact opposite of the Dreamcast VMU screen. Similar to the VMU, the PocketStation also runs on the standard CR2032 button cell batteries. But unlike the larger VMU, the PocketStation only requires one of them. Complete with 120 kilobytes of flash RAM, 2 kilobytes of SRAM, and a 32-bit ARM7T CPU, the PocketStation is very similar in form and function to the Sega VMU, with key differences being in the connectivity hardware and screen size. The display on a VMU is a 48 by 32 dot monochrome LCD, while the PocketStation is a smaller 32 by 32 LCD, and it also has the PlayStation logo watermarked into the unit's screen itself. And the next noteworthy difference is how the units communicate. As shown, the VMU units can be physically linked to each other to exchange data. Sony decided to go for the more futuristic route and implement infrared technology within the PocketStation. But even with that difference, it functions largely the same, allowing for the transfer of data and the ability to play multiplayer minigames. We said previously that the PocketStation was released in Japan during the winter of 1998, with no mention of North American or international releases. This is because the PocketStation never left the land of the rising sun. The official reasoning given for this by Sony was that the Japanese markets were having manufacturing issues with the PocketStation. They struggled to meet the extremely high demand for the unit. Coupling this shortage with a lack of compatible games proved a formula for failure. As a result, the PocketStation stayed in Japan until its discontinuation in July of 2002. A total of approximately 4.9 million units were produced. Strangely enough, the PocketStation retains some localized features with a small selection of North American games. This shows you just how close the PocketStation was to coming overseas. A couple examples I had in my collection are Ridge Racer Type 4 and Final Fantasy VIII. Both of these games still feature instructions in their manuals referencing PocketStation compatibility. The Ridge Racer Garage feature is fairly straightforward, as it allows for players to trade cars with friends. This is done with the aforementioned IR sensors in the PocketStation. However, the most desired PocketStation minigame is without a doubt Chocobo World, accessible through Final Fantasy VIII. There's actually some people that will import PocketStation specifically for this function. Chocobo World is very similar to Chow Adventure in that it's a watered-down RPG unlocked after catching a Chocobo in the Chocobo Forest. In Final Fantasy VIII, this will unlock a new Guardian Force, Boko, and you can send him to Chocobo World to collect items and gain experience by exploring, and occasionally your Chocobo will meet friends and enemies along the way. It's important to note that obtaining this minigame was a bit of a mission. To get to Chocobo World, you need to unlock flying, which is not obtainable until you're a few hours into Disc 2, so if you want to play for Chocobo World, prepare for the long haul. There are a few more NTSC games that work with the Sony PocketStation, but I don't happen to own them. These include SaGa Frontier 2 and Legend of Mana. Interestingly enough, one of the 3 PocketStations I ordered came with something already installed on it. However, I have no knowledge of hiragana, so the most I could do is just kind of fumble around with it. When I pop the PocketStation into a PlayStation, it shows icons for Sony's old cat mascot, Toro Inoue. So my assumption is that this likely had to come from Dokudemo Isho. But this looks like nothing I've seen online, so if you happen to know what this is, please let me know in the comments. If you happen to own a PocketStation outside of Japan and you want to get the most of it, the best and purest option would be to import a Japanese PS1 and Japanese games. But we don't really have that option, so we borrowed a modded console, and we bought some, but we live in the Midwest, so our selection of import games is not the best. It tends to fluctuate depending on where you go, but we still do have a few to show off. First up to show is Monster Farm 2, or as you might know it as Monster Rancher 2. It has similar functionality to Chocobo World in that you can use it to check on monsters and collect items, and it has some odd math game that I'm not quite sure what it's used for, but all of this is largely due to the language barrier. And I barely found the PocketStation section of the game as is. I had to do some very loose translation of the manual to learn that you have to take up a part-time job in-game to unlock the PocketStation section. And for my second game, I did some research and found that Metal Gear Solid Integral had a PocketStation feature. I slapped that into my eBay cart almost instantly. I'm familiar with the game through and through to the point of speedrunning it, and they even left in the English voice acting for extra comfort. So in theory, the PocketStation app should be much easier for me to get compared to something like Monster Farm 2, right? But as with my luck in all these videos, there was a caveat. As I mentioned, I had to play on a mod chip system to bypass the regional locking because I didn't want to go through imports, so as it turns out, Metal Gear Solid Integral is one of the few games that is specifically prohibited from playing on a modded system. So the most I could do is really just physically show you stuff from the manual and box, which specifically has reference to the PocketStation application you can unlock within the game. If you'd like to try to find some other videos of the Fox Die minigame, good luck. Footage of it has been pretty hard to find, and the most I could find was some obscure footage on the Chinese video hosting site Youku. From what I've gathered from research, you download the Fox Die virus onto your PocketStation and spread it like an actual virus between your friends. Doing this 5 times within 7 days unlocks the Gray Fox missions within the VR training disc. Regardless of my mixed experiences, it's still a very intriguing device, and I can only wonder what would have become of it if it crossed overseas and we got more localized games for it. As it stands, there's a pretty sizable library of games that are compatible with it in Japan. Some of these games include Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot 3 Warped, Rockman Complete Works, The Misadventures of Tronbon, Harvest Moon Back to Nature, and quite a few more. This is especially important since the PocketStation has had somewhat of a small revival in Japan, as the PlayStation Vita can emulate some key PocketStation games that you can buy from the PlayStation Store. Since there aren't any hard region locks on the Vita, if you want to reset your system and create a Japanese account, you too can play PocketStation games.
After researching both the Sega VMU and the Sony PocketStation, we couldn't help but notice that both units bear striking resemblance to a Tamagotchi. Not to mention, the most popular games on both of these units involve raising a virtual pet. For those of you unfamiliar with the Tamagotchi were small LED pocket games that allowed the user to simulate pet ownership. These toys were everywhere in the late 1990s, so it's probably no coincidence that both the VMU and the PocketStation resemble the Tamagotchi. Seriously, Tamagotchi were so big around 1995, 1996 that Shigeru Miyamoto himself had this to say about Tamagotchi during the Super Mario 64 development period. When we were stuck on the talk of the spectacular 3D graphics of Mario 64 and racing games, we saw a huge hit in the form of Tamagotchi, a tiny keychain boasting pictures made up of no more than 10 or 20 dots. At that time, I thought that Mario 64 had lost to Tamagotchi.
Yeah. I'm serious.
While Tamagotchi has had a small resurgence, they'll never be as popular as they were in the 1990s. The same can be said for these interactive memory cards. Memory cards are an accessory of the past, and they've evolved into contemporary SD cards and other flash memory devices. The VMU and the PocketStation, while once very expensive, are now fairly cheap and very accessible. If you want to take a nice little trip to the past, these memory cards are a fun way to add a little extra depth to your save file.
If you like this video, please visit our website, www.gameandbrowse.com. We've got videos like this, as well as written articles if you prefer reading. I'd also like to thank our first patron who contributed enough to get his name featured in this video. Thank you, Ronald S. Your contributions to helping keep us going is very much appreciated, so thank you for that. And if you're interested in supporting us as well, you can find links to our Patreon below, as well as all of our social media if you'd like to give us a follow and stay up to date on what we do. Thanks for watching.